Welcome to this beginner's guide for Monster Train. In this video, you're going to learn some very useful tips and tricks to make sure that you can get those angels dead in the ground in your train all the way to the finish line. Let's jump into this video and learn some good stuff right now. First tip up on the board is taking advantage of the information you get right away. Do not pass through these screens haphazardly. You need to pay attention to this because this is going to set up your deck strategy very early. So immediately we're going to see that we're getting a card that's taking advantage of spikes. So immediately this is telling me that I'm going to want to try and abuse spikes if at all possible if I want to take advantage of this card. Aside from that, we have an ability to increase burnout duration as well as increase attack damage. So my units that have burnout, I'm going to enhance them and make them last longer. And I'm going to try and get spikes so I can take advantage of this Bramble Lash, which is actually a very strong card. This is information you get right away when you start the run, and you cannot ignore this. Separately on this screen, you also see what kind of Seraph you're going to fight. There's 3 different variants of these. There's either one that's going to eat your spells, there's one that's going to cut your buffs in half, and there's also one that's going to reduce the attack damage on all of your people. Knowing which one you're going to fight is going to influence how you want to build your deck as you run through. So in this instance, we're fighting the buff debuff version, which means that if I'm trying to stack rage, I'm trying to stack spikes, I'm trying to stack regen, he's going to be cutting those in half. So if I'm going for a strategy that takes advantage of those, I have to make sure that it doesn't just pump a little bit, it has to pump a lot so that if it gets cut in half a couple times, the strategy still works. Or I want to just dodge that strategy altogether if I can't pump it high enough and I have to just go raw damage. So that's something that you have to take into account right away when you look at the screen. And immediately after that, do not pick your champion upgrades first. You need to look at the artifact first. The artifact is going to let you have a influence decision on how you want to change your champion. So if we look at our artifact options here, I see that I have yet another situation here with burnout. So it's dealing damage every time someone with burnout dies. This is actually kind of counteracting the ability that we saw before. This artifact wants my burnout units to die quickly to get the most effect out of it. However, the card that we got was increasing burnout duration. So these two cards don't play super well together. In this instance, we have something that's when something's being consumed, you do 30 damage up front. So if you were taking an artifact like this, you might want to try and lean on cards that have consume. Admittedly, neither of these artifacts are super crazy. However, this artifact is kind of fighting the other artifact. And since I know that I'm running an Awoken as my primary clan, I know that my hero is not going to have burnout unless I give it to it. So realistically, this card kind of fights what I already have. I would probably pick this one, even though neither of them are doing something too super crazy. I would probably pick this one first, and then you go to your champion, because now you have a better sense of what you want to do. So always make sure that you look at all the information immediately, start to form in your mind what strategies are going to work, what isn't going to work, what artifact is going to help you the best for that kind of a strategy, as well as what type of champion upgrade you want. But always do it in that order. Get as much information as you can before you make decisions. That's probably the best tips that I could give you. Next tip on the list are the trials. Generally, you want to be taking the trials as often as you can, so do not be afraid to not attempt the trials, but also be aware of the limits of the setup that you have. So for instance, 10 armor is very complicated in some situations. If your team has very low health units, this could be very rough. Also your spells, if they have things like Torch, or if you have like Vine Grasp, or even like a Frozen Lance, spells that don't do a ton of damage, but they can be useful. This is going to be almost completely negated by the enemies having 10 armor. So normally you could think I can torch the enemies in the backline and get free kills on those hard to hit people that are hiding behind the tanks. If they have 10 armor, they cannot. So always take into account how effective you think your deck is before you jump into these trials. Generally, I would say taking the trials early is generally the best. You can get a feel for how strong your deck is and how well it performs, but also know the limits. So try the trials as often as you can. The rewards are absolutely worth it, but also be aware of what your deck is weak against and which trials will really hurt you. So try and balance being aggressive, but being realistic. The next tip I want to give is understanding what your win conditions are and what is the required setup to get there. So There's a lot of different ways you can win in this game. You could stack tons of spikes, for instance, and let the enemy beat against you and have a ton of health. You could potentially have a ton of regen on an enemy that does a lot of damage. You could build enemies that have tons of attack and multi-strike on them, so that way you're just smacking people a bunch. But you need to understand that in order to beat the game, in order to get all the way through, you have to lean into something very, very hard. So the example that's being played right now is a deck that I had made, which is doing tons of spell damage, has tons of card draw potential, and just tons and tons and tons of draw and tons of damage. And I upgraded all of my spells to make sure they were essentially free and getting the right artifacts that play into that. So in order to even try and do something like that, you need to make sure that you're abusing your win condition. So if you're trying to stack armor so you can use a battering ram, you have to go super hard on armor. If you're trying to build rage, you need to build super hard into rage. But you can't just pick things that are good and be like, well, I need a tank, so I'm going to grab a tank, and I need a little guy who can hit for more, so I'm going to grab a little guy who can hit for more. Don't just arbitrarily pick cards and artifacts. If you're just arbitrarily picking cards that are like decent, but aren't really playing into the theme of your deck, you're going to find that you're going to struggle super hard when you get to the end game, because you're not going to have the mechanics that you need to actually get the win. You're just going to have a bunch of stuff that kind of works, but the moment the enemies start throwing curveballs at you, you're not going to be prepared. So know what your win condition is, abuse the hell out of it, and try and work as hard as you possibly can to make sure you get it. That is a tip that I can give you, because if you're not abusing your win condition, you're probably not going to win. As a rule of thumb, you want to keep your deck size pretty limited. You want to keep it to only the cards you actually care about. So do not be afraid to go to these unstable vortexes or go to the shop and actually spend money to get rid of cards. Getting rid of those original train stewards is very important. Getting rid of potentially torch spells that you no longer really need is also important. Deck sizes can range anywhere from like 20 cards to 30 cards. Probably that's about the range you want to stick into. If you see yourself like creeping really high, that's a sign that you need to thin your deck for sure. If you're pulling a lot of cards that you can't really use, make sure you run to that shop and you purge some stuff, or you hit that unstable vortex and you thin out your deck. You want to have the cards that you need when you need them. And if you're constantly pulling a bunch of garbage, that's not going to help you get your win condition. So always thin out your deck is another major tip for you guys. And the final tip that I'll give you guys is just to know the clans that you're playing. So your primary clan is affecting the champion that you get. Aside from that, aside from the champion, the cards that you can get can come from either of the two clans that you have. So if you're going for a Hellhorn kind of a clan, you're going to be focusing in on rage mechanics. You could potentially be focusing in on imps. You're very likely going to be doing some form of damage dealing, direct damage dealing via your units as a primary strategy. That is like generally what the Hellhorn is the best at. If you look at their units, they're doing a lot of rage mechanics, there's a lot of armor mechanics, there's a lot of imp mechanics. So if you're going more of an imp style, that's going to be like a draw heavy kind of a thing. You want artifacts that potentially get you imps every turn. If you're going more of a rage thing, you want artifacts that get you more rage, let you keep your rage, let you double the amount of rage that people get. You want to be leaning on those mechanics if you're going with the Hellhorned. If you're going with Awoken, these guys focus a lot more on healing. So there's a lot of regen strategies here. There's a lot of spike strategies here. There's also a lot of decent units. So you can see some multi-strikers with low health. There's a lot of damage you can do with units as well. I think Awoken is probably the most like beginner friendly clan that you can pick, because they are just very straightforward as far as how their mechanics work. So stack a ton of regen, stack a ton of spikes, pump up some of the units, hide them behind your champion. That's what your Awoken is going to be doing. The Stygian Guard is a more advanced clan, I would say, because they're going to be doing a lot of spells. So they master in a lot with Frostbite, which is damage basically over time that you can add on to people. They have a lot of sweep units, which are very useful. They deal a lot with spell weakness, which basically means that the number of stacks of spell weakness someone has on them is the amount of times a spell is amplified. So if someone has spell weakness 5 and you hit them with the spell, that spell will be doing 5 times damage. Their champion also is largely focused on doing lots of Frostbite or spell weakness. So again, I think this is a more advanced clan to use. So if you're still trying to start out and you're not super comfortable and you are just looking to win, maybe stay away from the Stygian clan initially, because they are probably a little more complicated, but incredibly powerful. So if you can get used to these mechanics, you'll get a lot of success out of that. The Umbra, I would say, is also fairly beginner friendly because this is generally going to focus in on heavy stat pumping on your units. And the way you're statting your units is basically by feeding them these morsels. So there's all kinds of ways to generate a ton of morsels. Your champion type is just going to be the super stacky huge guy. So if you're looking for mechanics in this situation that make morsels, get lots of draw, have ways of triggering consume, which is the gorge ability that you'll see. There's also a very easy win condition you can get, which takes advantage of void binding, for instance, which is applying damage, shield, rage, and ember drain. And there's also other cards that you can stack on top of this, which are doing very similar things, like Furnace Tap, for instance, which is also applying rage and multi-strike and ember drain. So this forces you down a path where you basically have no ember any turn, but you have a unit that can't die and is doing a ton of damage. So if you ever want to lean into that strategy, that's something that super works consistently. So again, if you're going with an Umbra style, you're going to be doing a lot of morsels, you're going to care about capacity. That's kind of the way they play. I think they're also very beginner friendly. And then you get to the melting, which is, I think, probably again a more advanced setup, because this requires managing and understanding burnout, understanding how you could abuse mechanics about people being burned out and reformed. So again, I think this is a little more advanced. It has tons of great synergy within it, but you have to understand how burnout works, how reforming works, and you also have to be comfortable with losing enemies and people all the time, which is very interesting and fun. But again, I think it's harder for beginner players to understand. So it's nice that the game starts you out with just the Hellhorned and the Awoken to initially start. I think they are by far the most beginner friendly clans, but understand what your clan is good at and what parts of your clan you want to lean into. Again, if you're running a Stygian guard, you're going to want to lean in on probably frostbite or spell damage. If you're running an Umbra, you're probably going to be wanting to lean in on consuming lots of morsels, generating lots of morsels. And then the Hellhorned and the Awoken just have very solid all-around units that you can use all over the place. So know what clans you have access to, know what kinds of strategies they generally lean towards, and try and abuse those as best as you can. Again, Monster Train is not a game of balance. Monster Train is a game of imbalance, and it is on you as the player to create that imbalance. You can create the most busted lineups in the world. You just have to lean in on a specific strategy to make sure you can do that. So those are the tips that I got for you guys. I hope that helped a bunch. I hope you're enjoying your time with Monster Train. I'm enjoying the hell out of this game, and I will see you in a future video. Love you guys. I'll see you later.